A homeless man found a wallet on the street containing $10,000 in cash. He hadn't eaten in 2 days and could have easily kept the money with no one knowing. What he chose to do instead will restore your faith in humanity and bring you to tears. The autumn rain fell steadily on downtown streets as Thomas Warren huddled under a store awning, his torn jacket doing little to protect him from the cold that seeped into his bones. He'd been homeless for 3 years, ever since medical bills from his wife's cancer treatment had bankrupted him, and the grief from losing her had made holding onto his job impossible. Most people walked past without seeing him, their eyes sliding away from his weathered face and cardboard sign, treating him as part of the urban landscape rather than a human being with a story. He hadn't eaten in 2 days, his stomach cramping with hunger, when something caught his eye on the wet sidewalk, just feet away from where countless pedestrians rushed past without looking down. A brown leather wallet lay abandoned in a puddle, apparently dropped by someone in the evening rush, stepped over or kicked aside by hurrying commuters, too focused on their destinations to notice. Thomas hesitated, his body screaming at him to ignore it, to avoid any situation that might bring police attention or accusations of theft. But something about the wallet's placement, right in the path of foot traffic where it would be ruined or stolen within minutes, made him reach out and pick it up. His cold fingers fumbled with the clasp, opening it to find identification, credit cards, and something that made his breath catch in his throat. A thick stack of $100 bills, more cash than he'd seen in years, more money than he could immediately count, but clearly thousands of dollars. Thomas's mind raced through possibilities that hunger and desperation made tempting. This money could feed him for months, could get him into a shelter through the winter, could maybe even help him start over somehow. No one had seen him pick it up. The owner probably hadn't even noticed it was missing yet. Who carries this much cash anyway? Probably someone who wouldn't even miss it, someone wealthy enough that $10,000 was pocket change. Every rational, survival-focused part of his brain screamed to put the wallet in his pocket and walk away. To take this gift, the universe had dropped at his feet when he desperately needed it most. But Thomas had been a different person before homelessness, before grief and financial ruin had stripped away everything he'd built. He'd been a teacher, someone who'd taught ethics and responsibility to high school students, someone who'd believed that character was measured by what you did when no one was watching. 3 years of living on streets hadn't completely erased that man, hadn't destroyed the values he'd once held, even though life had destroyed everything else. With shaking hands and a sick feeling that he was making the stupidest decision of his survival, Thomas looked at the ID in the wallet, memorized the address, and began the long walk across the city to return what he'd found. The address belonged to a modest house in a middle-class neighborhood, the kind of place Thomas used to live before his world collapsed. He stood on the porch for a long moment, acutely aware of how he must look and smell, knowing the person who answered the door would likely be frightened or disgusted, but he rang the bell anyway. A woman in her 40s opened the door, her face immediately showing wariness at the homeless man standing on her porch. Before she could speak, Thomas held out the wallet. "I found this downtown. The ID says this address. I wanted to return it to you or your husband. Everything's still inside. I didn't take anything." The woman's face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and growing emotion as she took the wallet and quickly checked its contents. Her hands started shaking and tears filled her eyes. "This is my husband's wallet. He's at the hospital right now. Our daughter needs emergency surgery tonight. He withdrew our savings, $10,000, to pay the hospital because our insurance has a high deductible. He was so panicked about getting to the hospital that he didn't realize he'd dropped it. We've been frantically calling everywhere, retracing his steps." She looked at Thomas with wonder and gratitude that made him uncomfortable. "You returned this? You could have kept it. You clearly need it. Why would you bring it back?" Thomas's voice was rough with emotion and hunger. "Because it's not mine. Because your daughter needs surgery. Because doing the right thing still matters, even when you have nothing, especially when you have nothing, because that's when character really shows." The woman started crying harder, and suddenly her husband appeared behind her, having just arrived home from the hospital. She turned to him. "David, this man found your wallet." He returned it, all $10,000. He walked across the city to bring it back to us. David's face showed the same progression of emotions. ending with tears as he realized that a homeless stranger who clearly needed help himself, had saved their ability to pay for their daughter's surgery. What happened next happened quickly, both parents overcome with emotion and gratitude, insisting Thomas come inside, making him coffee and a sandwich while he sat awkwardly in their living room, unused to being treated like a guest rather than a problem. They asked his story, really listened as he explained about his wife's cancer, the medical bankruptcy, the grief that made him unable to function, the slide into homelessness that happened faster than he could stop. David and his wife Sarah looked at each other, having one of those silent conversations married couples can have without words, and David pulled out his phone. Within an hour, David had called contacts at his company, explaining Thomas's teaching background and getting him an interview for a tutoring position. Sarah had contacted a friend who managed transitional housing for the homeless, securing Thomas a spot, starting immediately. They'd gone online and ordered clothes, shoes, and toiletries to be delivered to the transitional housing address. David wrote a check for $2,000, pressing it into Thomas's hand despite his protests. "You gave us $10,000 when you had every reason to keep it. This is the least we can do. But more than the money, we want to help you rebuild. You proved tonight that your character survived everything that happened to you." That's rare and valuable. The tutoring job led to a teaching position within 6 months. Thomas's references from his previous career still valid, his skills still sharp despite years of disuse. The transitional housing gave him stability to rebuild his life, piece by piece, day by day. He reconnected with his adult son who'd lost touch during his homeless years, explaining everything and slowly mending that broken relationship. Sarah and David's daughter's surgery was successful, and the families stayed connected. Thomas becoming an honorary uncle to the little girl, whose medical crisis had inadvertently become the catalyst for his redemption. But more than his own transformation, Thomas's story spread, shared by Sarah and David as an example of character existing in unexpected places, of humanity surviving, despite circumstances designed to destroy it. Local news picked up the story, and suddenly Thomas found himself interviewed about his choice to return the wallet, about maintaining ethics when life gave you every excuse to abandon them. The attention led to more people helping others experiencing homelessness in their community. Donations to shelters increasing, volunteering rising, as people recognized that circumstances didn't define character, that the person sleeping on the street might have more integrity than those walking past in expensive shoes. Years later, Thomas, now stable and teaching again, returned to that same street corner where he'd found the wallet, volunteering weekly to distribute food and supplies to people still living the life he'd escaped. He'd tell anyone who would listen that he hadn't returned the wallet to be a hero or get rewards. He'd done it because it was right, because somewhere beneath the layers of loss and hardship, he was still the person who believed actions mattered. That one choice in a moment of desperate hunger had reminded him who he used to be and could be again.